Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome back to Wall Street Silver. Our guest today is Matthew Piepenburg. He is the commercial director of Matterhorn Asset Management. Welcome back, sir.
Good to be back. Always,
Yeah, it's a
always.
it's a pleasure having you back on Wall Street Silver. So, Matthew, you wrote the book Rigged to Fail. What's the most obvious symptom you see out there that things are rigged to fail? What does it mean?
Yeah, and then the book a couple of years ago came out about just the Fed and Wall Street and the mechanizations going on behind the bailouts, et cetera. But I think today, something I think it's really interesting, and I just saw this graph last week. Eric King had put it out on King World News, and Eric's great, and I love talking to Eric. And it was basically a synopsis of all or total U.S. stock market wealth. I think it's metaphorical for all central banks and markets, but it showed that the top 90% of all stock market wealth across all indexes is really held by the top 10% of the U.S. population. And that the bottom 50% of the U.S. population enjoys about 1% of U.S. Stock market wealth. And so when you think about the implications of that for a second, it's more than just obvious signs of who's really benefiting from the stock markets. But if 90% of stock market wealth is held by the top 10% of the US population, you got to look back into the great financial crisis, the bailouts, TARP, the relief programs, the bank bailouts, the AIG
Hmm.
bailouts, and then the trillions of dollars in our Fed balance sheet, which could have gone to a lot of other things. This printed money. Remember, 2008, the Fed balance sheet was just under a trillion. Now it's over 9 trillion. So if you think about that as a metaphor, $8 trillion, which could have gone to a lot of better things for the American economy and the real economy, went into the Fed balance sheet, which effectively went into the bond market, which effectively went into the stock market, created the greatest asset bubble in history, the greatest wealth transfer in history. But if trillions and trillions of printed mouse click money was effectively used to support a minority of the US population, and it reminds me of this famous quote by Andrew Jackson, who was subsequent to Thomas Jefferson, staunch anti-private central banks in the American system. And Andrew Jackson, in his typical kind of tone, said, a U.S. private central bank, independent central bank, would be the prostitution of our government for the benefit of a few at the expense of the many. That was 1836, and here we are in
Wow.
2022. And trillions of dollars later, in just a short period of time between the great financial crisis and today. And what is the net result? We've just made the top 10%, of which I am a member, wealthier, and we've ignored the bottom 90% of this country. That's not healthy for even the top 10%. What the implications of that for social unrest, for political dysfunction, which is everywhere in the world and particularly true today in the US, there are so many reasons to divide this country with identity politics or transgender rights or critical race theory or all the things that are making the headlines, which are important, I understand. But if you think about it, what's really going on here is a wealth transfer
Right.
and a completely rigged system. With this much attention going to bail out a market and create the greatest bubble I've ever seen, and I've been through the dot-com bubble and the great, the subprime bubble, this is appalling. And I think it's important to step back from yield curves and spreads and the DXY and relative currency strength and just think about what this central bank has done to the fabric of the social fabric of our country. And for central bankers like Powell to arrogantly presume that he has no impact on the social reality of our country. In fact, I would argue that the central bank is probably the most powerful force in American policy in DC. And theoretically, it's an independent private bank. Let's not forget its origins or its real master. In some ways, they say that the central bank serves Wall Street. I think the central bank serves itself. It runs our policies. It creates our policies. It has more power out of DC than anything in the White House right now.
Hmm.
And again, and I'm not trying to make fun of Democrats or Republicans. I'm kind of agnostic as to both and cynical about all politicians. But our country does not have strong leadership right now, regardless of your extreme views. I mean, we literally have a weekend at Bernie's president. He is not cognitively there. And that, when you hear him talk about things like the dollar with almost zero professionalism, you wonder this kind of economic ineptitude, not just at the White House level, but at the Congress or the House or the Senate. The level of mediocrity passing for representation is terrifying. And of course, in Canada, again, I don't want to get anti-Trudeau or pro-left or right, but there's a real dearth of leadership in the world. We're certainly seeing
Right.
it in the UK, we're seeing it in France, we're seeing it in all over Europe. But that graph and that kind of empirical reality of what really and who really has benefited from this massive amount of mouse click money, which is inflationary and destabilizing, effectively going to a minority of people, of which I'm theoretically a member. But again, that doesn't bode well for the future of my
Not
country.
theoretical, not theoretical. No,
You
hey,
know,
but
yeah,
Matthew, I do want to agree with you on one point, on a lot of those points, but it does seem there's one point I want to focus on. Our leadership does seem literally economically illiterate these
yeah,
days. I mean, and it's
yeah,
not, and I'm not picking on one side or the other. Both sides
yeah,
appear to
absolutely.
be have just zero understanding of both common sense and economics.
Yeah,
And we see it from the left, you see it from the right, you see it in Europe, you see it in the United States, you see it in Canada. And it's just, you look back at leaders that we had, 50, 70 years ago,
yeah,
and it just seems such low quality. And I don't know
yeah,
if that's a function of our system and the way we elect people, and or the types of people who are attracted to run for office.
yeah.
The incentives just don't seem to be there. And what's going on in Europe right now? A lot of people have criticized Germany. I know you're living in Switzerland right now, so you're in that area and you're right there in the heart of these energy problems that are occurring. And we hear about the decisions Germany's making to shut down nuclear power plants in the middle of a energy crisis. I mean, Belgium did the same thing with a nuclear power plant. And we ask ourselves, what are these people thinking? I mean, is it just that far? Are they just that far gone where it's just pure ideology and they don't even care anymore?
There's so many questions in there, Jim, because the
Yeah,
larger
I'm
question, I
ranting. I'm
agree.
ranting. I'm sorry.
I mean, I fully understand the frustration. I mean, this is not the days of Kennedy or Eisenhower or Truman or any
Right.
great leaders. Certainly not the days of Jefferson, Madison, or Adams, or any of our founding fathers' visions. We're so disconnected from all those ideals. There's so many reasons. I mean, I think the pathological narcissism of wanting to be a politician as opposed to serving the people, it's really more about serving yourselves. And you can buy votes and you can buy time by promising things with mouse click money through the Fed or through lobbyists to really distort democracy. The very notion of lobbying is effectively legalized bribery.
Right.
And there is, I think, for every member of the House, there are at least 4 financial lobbyists from big business, big tech. So that in and of itself is an insult to the notion of an elected leadership that represents its constituency. And then, of course, there's the media that does a colonoscopy of everything in your life. No one wants to run for office and have their entire personal life brought forward. So there are a lot of reasons why the best and the brightest want nothing to do with this popularity table at the cafeteria that is the U.S. House. These are the mediocre C-minus students and JV athletes of a prior era. It's not our best and brightest. I would much rather work in any private enterprise than run for office because I don't think I could be effective and I wouldn't even be proud of it. It literally wouldn't give me great pride to say I'm a member of the U.S. House because it's an embarrassment to its ideals. And that's my opinion, but it really doesn't attract, I think, the greatest minds. I think the other larger question about why Europe is taking these suicidal policies with energy and with the sanctions, and they're just shooting themselves in the foot over and over, is they follow so much of the Western lead. And the larger question is, what is the Western lead? Is it the U.S.? Is it Davos? Is it the Bilderbergs? Who really is making decisions? We certainly know that Biden isn't making the decisions in the U.S. We know
Right.
that. Again, regardless of your party. So who and what really makes the decisions on policy, economic, military? What is the dark state? These weird kind of dual nationals at the Pentagon making policy, spending billions for regime change in 2014 in the Ukraine and opening a Barbarossa-like door to insult Putin. Again, not taking a pro-Putin or anti-Putin stance, but the lack of any interest in peace right now in the
Right.
Ukraine. Who is making these decisions? And it's the same question whether it's Boris Johnson or Macron or whoever's going to be the new prime minister next after a 6-week failure. Who's following whose lead and who's really thinking independently? The problem is countries like France have no real vital strategic assets, so they have to ally themselves with others to get things done. But even Macron is kind of tired of the double standard. He's openly said it in U.S. policy, financial policy, and political policy. Germany is blindly following the West to its detriment. And if you talk to Germans on the street, they're just as cynical about their government and my government, or the US government, as anyone else. In the Swiss National Bank right here in Switzerland, I mean, they're taking $11 billion swaps from the Fed to keep liquidity because there's a problem with dollar illiquidity.
Wow.
So much of following the US lead, which has been a disaster pretty much since Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan. And again, not to bemoan or demean the servicemen and women who fight in our wars all over the
Right.
world. They're the best people I've ever met, but they're donkeys, leading lions right now. They are donkeys leading lions, and so we're making a mess all over the world. And the question is, whose benefit is that? Whose power is being held? And again, when you look at that first graph, the Fed supporting the top 10% of the population, I mean, whose interests are governments really trying to serve? And are they trying to effectively, well, they already have effectively killed capitalism. What we have is feudalism and a handout dependent population in Europe and the US, where that's better than pitchforks. Blame it on COVID, blame it on Putin, blame it on climate change and oil well, or blame it on the coal plant. Never blame it on these dark, mysterious figures at the central bank and the Pentagon and elsewhere who are making decisions. And then make the people feel like the government cares about you by sending you a check or taking care of you or locking you down. I mean, I think it's repulsive. I think more and more people, left and right, are starting to question who's really making these decisions. It's not going to be found on a Google search. I can't
Yeah,
give you the
no.
answer, but I don't think it's Biden, Macron, or Olaf Scholz. I think they're
Klaus Schwab.
trapped.
It's Klaus Schwab.
Whatever. I mean, Davos is not too far from where I'm sitting, but it's that's a joke too. People, they don't have credibility, but they certainly have power. But the real power is in the central banks, and I think you follow the money, and eventually you'll find the culprits.
Right.
But the absolute disaster of the social fabric of Europe and the U.S. is now unfolding in real time, and they're going to always blame somebody else. You'll never see a central banker take accountability for any decision. We killed capitalism with Greenspan, Bernanke, Powell, and Yellen. We did. We've monetized our securities market into what is effectively Wall Street socialism. And that was what Rig to Fail is about. But again, going back to that original point, the only people that have benefited from years of this mismanaged monetary policy is a small minority of extremely wealthy stock market participants who know how to hedge and arbitrage and buy physical gold and get out of the way after they've created a disaster for the rest of the world.
You're a gold guy, so I got to switch the subject there to what's affecting the gold markets and silver markets these days. And one of the issues a lot of people believe is holding back gold and silver is the DXY, the dollar, the strong dollar, and despite the dollar's technically losing buying power for Americans relative to other currencies, the dollar is strong.
Absolutely.
So that's DXY. I hate to say the dollar is strong because our buying power is declining. We buy less and less in our grocery carts every month, it seems like. But that is, despite how people describe this and what the actual situation is,
Right.
it is undeniably affecting gold prices and silver prices in US dollar terms. So what's your thinking here? Why is this happening? Why is the dollar so strong right now? And what's going to change this? What's the Fed doing right now?
That's great point. There's so many ways to answer it. I mean, of course, the DXY its relative strength is really, I joked about it in an article I wrote last week. Bragging about being the strongest currency in the world right now is like bragging about being the strongest terminally ill patient at the ICU. I mean, we're strong relative to the yen and the euro at decades high. They're at decade lows versus the dollar.
Right.
So our strength is still relative strength. The inherent purchasing power of the dollar remains anemic at best, and inflation is killing it. But why is the dollar strong? First of all, there is the milkshake theory that Brent Johnson has written about better than I have, and I've written about over the last many years. There is still the fact that the U.S. dollar is, whether we like it or not, for a short period left, the world reserve currency. That has immense power. The U.S. dollar is a key component of the derivatives market, and it's a key component of the euro dollar market. And that takes a huge amount of demand. Those two markets, the derivative markets and the euro dollar markets, absorb a lot of dollars, which get tangled up in options and swaps and other central, commercially bank confused weapons of mass destruction, which suck a lot of dollars out, but don't put it back into the system. So you have a very illiquid dollar being tangled up like a fly fishing net or mess of fly fishing cord that's just unable to be straightened out. So it's not liquid or available dollars. So that pushes the dollar up. The derivatives market, the Eurodollar market, the repo market demand $2 trillion a day in overnight loans to support the money markets. That's backdoor QE. That's massive demand for the dollar. That pushes the dollar up. And I think finally and equally deliberately, Yellen and Biden and even Larry Summers, like I joke, what a brain trust that must have been, got together months ago during these sanctions and thought of ways to um, increase demand in the U.S. markets. And one way is to make the dollar stronger, make that the better asset. It's certainly by, I think, less informed investors. There's a lot of flows in the U.S. dollar because it is relatively stronger than other currencies, and the yield in the 10-year at 4% is still better than other currencies. And so there's this a naive assumption that the dollar will be as strong tomorrow as it is today. There's so many reasons why I don't think that's the case. But I think that combination of derivative demand, euro dollar demand, repo market demand, and then deliberate Fed fund rate policy. When you raise the Fed funds rates, you make the dollar stronger. And there's a deliberate need to make the dollar strong in the short term by the Fed and by the Treasury Department. That was also ostensibly to attract U.S. capital into, or excuse me, foreign capital into U.S. markets, which it did do, and then that didn't work either. And we still need to print more money to buy our own treasuries. There's still not enough foreign demand. The other thing that's done, I've joked with friends like the U.S. or allies like the U.S. who needs enemies, because the U.S. thinks only of itself. Its quote unquote allies are being clipped by a strong dollar because trillions, over 14 trillion in global debt has to be paid back to some bank somewhere in the US and elsewhere in US dollar denominated debt agreements. Right. So these other countries from Argentina to London to Tokyo have to pay US dollar backed debt. That means they have to debase their currency to create more access to buy more dollars. And you saw that in the case of Japan. They just had to dump a bunch of US treasuries to keep their yen from tanking, and they've had to print more money ad infinitum to create more yen, to buy more dollars, to pay off loans and debts. But if Japan is struggling, you can only imagine, developing economies or third world economies. And you've seen the United Kingdom, their prime minister of short duration tried to cut taxes without cutting spending. And, the government said, we can't afford it. And one of the reasons they can't afford it, the UK's, currency has tanked vis-a-vis the dollars, practically at parity, which was unheard of at one time. So all the other currencies in the world are getting beaten to death by this bully called the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury Department, two mediocre minds of the highest level, Yellen and Powell, who don't think outside of the box of any other country but themselves, export their inflation, strengthen their dollar, and clip the wings of debt-based countries all over the world. If you read that great book, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, this is nothing new from the IMF, from the Fed, forcing third world economies into debts they can't repay. Wow. And effectively exporting our inflation. So again, I'm American. I believe in capitalism. I've been eating apple pie my whole life. I played baseball and loved it all. But this is not the America I studied in grad school, in law school, or in the history departments of some great universities. So it's an embarrassment. It's a shadow of its former self. But all of those reasons have made the dollar stronger. The reason that's not sustainable is eventually, it's clipping our allies. It's destroying the rest of the world. It's certainly destroying our export, our whatever that we do still manufacture in the U.S., but little there is that isn't made in China, has no competitiveness. When you have an American toaster at a high U.S. dollar price, it's not going to compete against a Russian or a German or even a French toaster because the dollar is too strong. So it's not helping our trade deficits or our budget deficits. It's really, I think, a short-term plan to buy some time, but I think it's crippling the rest of the world. And it's forcing countries like the BRICS to look eastward or look elsewhere for partners in trade and in currencies. And it's certainly forcing other countries like India and China and other countries to think of other ways to buy petrol outside of the petrodollar. So it's slow and steady. It's not going to happen overnight, but the hegemony of the US dollar, the short-term strength, is really myopic. It's really destructive globally. It's not even benefiting the US. Yes, it's keeping the gold price down. That's for sure in US dollar terms. If you look at the gold price in terms of the British pound sterling or the yen, it's a different story. It's a different chart. Right. But even this strong dollar in this Fed funds rate, remember, every time the US Fed raises rates by 1%, our interest expense goes up by 300 billion. So America can't afford for Powell to be Volcker reborn. And, my opinion is Powell is being completely disingenuous about fighting inflation anyway with these rising rates. I think he has another agenda altogether. Again, the Fed never tells what it really says or really thinks. It always makes up some other story, but that's nothing new because they're as political as the White House.
Well, this is the gold chart, and you're right. In dollar terms, it is down in the 1650, 1650 area, mid 1600 range right now.
Mhm.
And here is the DXY chart. It's just been going vertical
Yeah,
lately.
incredible.
Eventually, I would agree this ends. The dollar milkshake, I think Brent Johnson, he didn't come up with the theory, he came up with the slogan dollar
Yeah,
milkshake, and he likes to
yeah,
pretend that he actually came up with the theory. It's actually an old theory that's been around a long time.
yeah,
So I try
yeah.
to point that out. Brent Johnson's not exactly a deep thinker. He's a slogan type of guy. But and he'll admit that when you nail him down. Um, it's in his prediction is DXY is going to 150, and we're
Wow.
nowhere near that. It's where here we are at 112, and he's taking victory laps like he's
Yep.
actually right. He's not.
Mm,
But at some point, this actually breaks the world economy,
it does.
um, and I think we need to make that clear. The U.S. government doesn't want this going to 120 or 130. The U.S. government, as you rightly pointed out, that destroys the competitiveness of our exports.
Mhm.
At some point in this process, China and Japan are going to start selling U.S. treasuries, and they can drive the 10-year bond yield up to 10% easily by just starting to dump all
Yeah.
their treasuries. And
Yes.
that essentially craters our economy at that point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're not, while they may be economically illiterate, I don't know if Powell and Yellen are that illiterate where they're going to allow that to happen.
Yeah, I wrote an article about a month ago. Is the Fed or the financial policymakers in the U.S. and the West, are they evil or stupid or both? Because this makes no sense in terms of,
Yeah.
they'd have to be incredibly stupid. I many things about Powell and Yellen. They don't have low IQs. They have some basic understanding of history. So what are they really thinking here? Do they actually think they can contain this and control a soft landing recession? Keep in mind, the Fed works like all politicians by saying one thing and thinking something entirely
Right.
different. Powell is saying he's rising rates or raising the Fed funds rate to fight inflation. Well, look, we know that the reported inflation around 8 to 9% is as bogus as, is anything else. And so, it's even if you assume 8 to 9% inflation, a Fed funds rate of 5 or 6% doesn't beat the inflation. But if you know that the real inflation is closer to 16%, then we know that if you've got a yield in the 10-year of about 4% and a true 16% CPI, if you use the Volcker scale of the 1980s, so then you've got negative real rates of about 12%. That's the real reality. You can use fictional writing, the BLS, which is like the Iowa Writers Project. It's fiction writing. Everyone knows that on Wall Street. The BLS and the CPI is bogus. So if I'm Powell and I'm in debt, I would do the same thing if I were a corrupt politician. I would say I'm trying to fight inflation. I would ignore the social impact of what my policies are doing and pretend that's not my fault. It's COVID or some other engineered disaster. But I
Putin.
would want negative real rates. I'd want inflation to outpace the yield in the 10-year. It's such a degree and scope that I can inflate away my debt. Because what better way to get out of debt than to debase your currency's purchasing power, use inflation to get out of debt? And that's
Right.
what he's doing. And then now would I lie about inflation, which they've been doing for decades, I would also lie about the recession. We're in a recession, in my opinion.
Mhm.
But if I'm Powell, I'm going to lie and say, not yet, not yet. Because once we're officially in a recession, you have never in the history of capital markets beaten a recession with a strong currency and rising rates. So when we're officially in a recession, then he's going to pivot. He's going to bring down rates and he's going to bring down the dollar, and gold and silver will skyrocket. Everyone says, "Oh, Matt, you're a gold executive in Switzerland. You're apologizing." No, this strong dollar is not sustainable.
Not at all. They can't leave it hot. I mean, they can't leave it at they're going to raise rates probably 2 more times at least through December.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to be cratering the market and the housing market and the mortgage market and everything by then. But at some
and
point,
that's the the part I said. Are they stupid? Or are they evil? Because if they keep raising the dollar, they will destroy the European economy and the Western economy. They will. It's mathematical. The debt's too high. The rates are too high. It's not payable. That would be like a master plan to destroy the world economy, to create some new world order, blame it on COVID and Putin and China, and then make little peasants and serfs out of this feudalistic society. That's dark Davos thinking. I have no idea if that's the case, but it's either really stupid or really evil.
Well, a lot of people think that's the plan, is to crash asset prices so that the BlackRocks and the Blackstones and the hedge funds of the world can come scoop up everything dirt cheap because they have cheaper access to capital.
Wow.
And hey,
Yeah.
you will own nothing and be happy. That's a theory, right?
It's a theory. It's a theory.
But we're not playing that game. I believe a pivot or a pause is inevitable. It's mathematical certainty that they can't keep going the way they're going.
Mhm.
And at some point, gold and silver just launch.
Yep.
But Matthew,
Yep.
thank you very much for joining us. And we're definitely going to you get passionate, just like ranting.
That was
sort of like I do
great.
out there. And so we'll definitely have you back in the next 3 months or so, and we'll do it again.
Look forward to it. Look forward to it.